Dear students, over here, welcome to this presentation on survey research. I'm sure some of you have already thought of their topics and some are still planning their topics. Myself and my colleagues, we have taken you through research methods and we've covered a number of topics. And we have dealt extensively on experimental design. Now, I know some of you would carry out an experiment, whereas others are anticipating to carry out a survey. So the purpose of this presentation is to introduce to you what a survey is. I want to tell you this is not exhaustive, but I will try to touch on major aspects that are necessary for your understanding of survey research. Now, what is survey research? Survey research basically is used to answer questions that have been raised, solve problems that have been posed or observed. Okay, it's important. Assess needs and set goals. Determine whether or not specific objectives have been met. Establish baselines against which future comparisons can be made. Analyze trends across time and generally to describe what exists in what amount and in what context. Now, I want us to understand this definition clearly. So for you to carry out a survey, there must be a problem or there must be questions that needs to be answered. So you might carry out a survey to assess needs or to set goals, determine whether or not specific objectives have been met. For instance, if it is a project with specific objectives, you can go to the people, you can go into the field to try and establish if the objectives of that particular project have been met or not. More importantly, to establish baselines. I want to outline to you that the government of Namibia, through the Ministry of Agriculture, they are implementing a project called NAMSIP. This NAMSIP is to do with the mechanization and the seed improvement within the country. Now, before the implementation of the NAMSIP project, where people will be given machinery, farmers will be given machinery, and some people who wants to embark on the seed production will be supported by the government. Before embarking on this project, last year we undertook a countrywide survey. The countrywide survey was meant to establish what we call baselines. So we wanted to establish what is the current status quo in terms of machinery, what is available. How many tractors do we have, for instance? What is the level of mechanization? What irrigation systems are being used by the people? Any seed producer that we have, how much seed does those producers produce? So those are called the baselines. When we are to then say, after the implementation of the project, NAMSIP was successful, the success must be measured between 2 points. So baseline is the starting point or the origin. Whatever is being recorded in future must be matched against what was there. So basically, that is the purpose of a survey. Survey, we go to the people, we go to the field, we collect data. Unlike an experiment where we go into a field, and you can see an experiment in most cases is somehow localized. Of course, we can have multi-site experiments, but experiments by the nature, they are in most cases localized. You can do an experiment at Newdam Farm, you can do an experiment at Ogongo Farm, you can carry out an experiment in Hentis Bay, just to look at certain aspects, whereas the survey, you need to sort of extend a bit and cover quite a number of subjects. Now, what distinguishes a survey? What makes survey research different? Survey research is used to quantitatively describe specific aspects of a given population. A population in this case can be farmers, can be a group of fishing companies. It can be anything basically. When we talk of a population, we are not just defining population in the context of, say, human beings. It can be population of animals, any group of elements that are of interest. Data required for research for survey are collected from people and are therefore subjective. You see, by nature, when you ask even two people who went to a certain function, if you ask them how was the function, you are bound to get completely two different views, despite that these people attended the function same day, same time. So it all depends on how you see things. So how John sees things is different from how Peter sees things. So, but these are the people that we go to and we are saying, tell us about a certain subject. And by nature, therefore, the responses are, in most cases, subjective. So survey research uses a selected portion of the population, from which the findings can later be generalized back to the population. This is very, very important. When we went last year, as I told you, through all the 14 regions of the country, we did not ask each and everyone. It was selected people within a region. So those people, they are somehow going to represent the entire region. So if we go to Omusati, for instance, Erongo, we can just ask 200 farmers, but there are more than 200 farmers in Omusati. So that is what we survey uses selected portion. You select a few people and then the results from those people can be generalized or inferred. We can extend the result to explain the whole population. Independent and dependent variables are used to define the scope of study, but cannot be explicitly controlled by the researcher. Unlike in experimental research, dear students, we did pointed out that when it comes to experimental research, we manipulate the independent variables, which we call the treatments. We manipulate them, we control them. Then we observe the dependent variable or the variate or simply the endogenous variable. In the case of a survey, dependent variables, we just use them to define the scope. When we talk of the scope, I'm sure we normally use this term in some context, and that is the same context actually. So when we talk of the scope, we use the dependent to just define what we call the parametric scope, the confines in which the research is enclosed, the enclosures of the research. You see, in other words, we are just saying this research is enclosed within this context. We don't go beyond. So that is defined by dependent and independent variables. That is the parametric. But we can't control. For example, if we are asking people about gender, what is the gender of this person? Gender becomes one of the variables. It can be dependent and independent depending on the context, depending on how the researcher wants to use the variable gender. But you don't control gender. You cannot manipulate. You just go, you ask the person, oh, this one is a female, this one is a male, and so forth. That is basically what we are trying to say there. I don't want you to mix terms. Survey research versus survey. A survey is simply a data collection tool for carrying out survey research. That is a survey. It is a data collection tool for carrying out survey research. Survey means it is actually a means for gathering information about the characteristics, actions, or opinions of a large group of people. Survey can also be used to assess needs, evaluate demand, and examine impact. In this case, when you go to the farmers, suppose you want to supply input, there is an input scheme that is about to come. You can go to the farmers to actually establish what is critical, what do farmers need. For instance, from the previous example that I gave you, when we carried out a national survey last year, one of the questions that we were asking, for instance, was, do you need any irrigation facilities? Are you using some irrigation facilities? If you are to require any irrigation facility, do you have the source of water, for instance? Where will you draw the water from? You see, that is sort of a need to establish the needs. You can also do that to evaluate demand. You ask people, what would you prefer? What is needed here? What is not needed here? That is to gauge and say, okay, people are most likely to demand this type of goods and so forth. Now, what are the strengths and weaknesses of surveys? Just like any other research type, there are strengths and weaknesses. In terms of strength, surveys can obtain information from large population. This is very true. Can get information from the whole of Namibia with a survey. It is suited to gather demographic data that describe the composition of the sample. That is true. You can actually tell the demographic, socio-demographic characteristics. You can actually gather them through a survey. Nothing else can do this besides a survey. You cannot tell the demographics in Erongo or in Commerce without undertaking a survey. That is impossible. For you to tell who is who, what is gender, age, and all those parameters, religion, and so forth, social demographics can only be done through a survey. Surveys are inclusive in the types and number of variables that can be studied. There are no limitations. Remember when we did RCBD, CRD, split plot, Latin square, and so forth, we were talking of the restrictions in terms of the number of variables. Yes, you can do factorial, but you cannot extend factorial beyond certain limits. There are limits when it comes to the number of variables that can be studied. But when it comes to survey, yes, in as much as there are limits, but they are quite inclusive. They are quite inclusive. You can, though not exhaustive, but they can actually carry a number, huge variables. It requires minimal investment, yes, of course, but I want you to also take note that equally so, surveys can be costly, but they require a minimal investment to develop and administer and are relatively easy for making generalizations. Yes, it's true. Now, survey can also elicit information about attitudes that are otherwise difficult to measure using observational studies. You see, when you go and observe, it is very, very difficult to tell the attitude of a person towards a certain aspect. It's difficult to tell. But with a survey, you are able to do so. You can actually assess the attitude. But weakness is unsuitable where an understanding of the historical context of phenomena is required. You can't use surveys where a deep understanding of the past is needed. Biases may occur either in the lack of response from intended participants or in the nature and accuracy of the responses that are received. I can tell you, when it comes to survey, we basically rely on the respondents, on the community. Some may decide not to respond, which is their cardinal right. You cannot force people to respond to your questions. You can only solicit the information. But sometimes also people, for some reasons, they might give you completely wrong information. because of their vested interest in what you are asking. Other sources of error including intentional misreporting behaviors by respondents to confound survey results or to hide inappropriate behavior. It's very difficult to ask if you go to a community and ask, do you have, maybe you want to assess how many, those people, how many criminals do you have in this? Are you a criminal or so? You will never, it's very difficult actually to get such information. People will sort of, withdraw giving such information. Respondents may also find very difficult to assess their behavior. No one will say, I am not well behaved. No one. No wonder if you ask even in a class to say, what is your religion? I don't want to finish this statement, but I can tell you, just go and assess and then ask yourself, how many have responded correctly? How many have responded correctly? I've noticed even those people who have never visited a church once, they will tell you, I'm a Christian. They will tell you like that. So, in most cases, responses are sometimes not accurate. That is one weakness of a survey. Now, let me introduce some few terms. There's what we call verbal surveys, are often known as interviews, and written surveys are questionnaires. So when you go and ask somebody verbally, of course you may have the questions written down, but we call those interviews. You interview the people, but when you have written surveys, when you write them and you are issuing them and so forth, we normally refer to them as questionnaires. But of course, I want you to take note that interviews, you can interview from a paper. Questionnaires, you can also have a well-written document and you ask the person you are completing yourself, which is face-to-face. Of course, we are going to cover that in more detail. Now, what is reliability? Reliability is often used to refer to the consistency of survey responses over time. If you go and you ask people from Oshakati about a certain subject, obviously you analyze the responses, you make a certain conclusion. If you come after a certain time, are you able to make the same conclusion that you made? That is what we refer to as reliability of the results. If you ask today and you make a conclusion, tomorrow you come, you make a different conclusion, the other day you come, you make a different conclusion, we say the results are unreliable. What decision are you going to make? Because the results depends on when you are asking. So we want the results to be reliable, to be reliable. So we also have what we call item consistency, determine whether the responses for each question are consistent across constructs. Now, when you are asking, when we talk of item, if you are asking a certain question, are the responses consistent across construct? Do they change from one construct to the other? Now, the other term worth defining is validity. It is the extent to which the measurements of the survey provide information needed to meet the study's purpose. Dear students, when you go for a survey, you don't go for a survey without objectives. So you must formulate your objectives beforehand. When you go to a survey, you gather information that is appropriate to address the purpose of the study. So when we say validity, when we say the survey is valid, we are asking ourselves, to what extent do the measurements of the survey provide information which is needed to meet the study's purpose? Now, let's look at the survey process. Ladies and gentlemen, this is very, very important. We understand survey is to do with us going into the field and getting the information, but let us also appreciate the process. When we talk of a process, obviously we must have some inputs to a process. must have some inputs, and then once we have inputs, we must put the inputs together to give us some outputs. So it's an input-output issue, but for you to get an output, you must process the inputs. So this is the process that we are talking about. So what are the ingredients to a survey? In other words, what are the inputs? Survey design involves 2 steps. So in other words, these are the inputs. Firstly, you must have a sampling plan. The sampling plan is the method that will be used to select the sample from the population. It describes the approach that will be used to select the sample, how an adequate sample size will be determined, and the choice of the media, how the data will be gathered, what media will be used. Are you going to send emails? Are you going to go there? So this is the sampling plan, which is part of a survey design. Secondly, procedure for obtaining population estimates from the sample data and for estimating the reliability of those estimates must be established. This process includes identification of the desired response rate and the preferred level of accuracy for the survey. So, dear students, for you to begin a survey, you must have a sampling plan. I have always noticed a situation where students come and present, I'm going to undertake a survey, but when you ask them, they don't have the basic issues that will enable them to carry out a survey. So one of the issues is to have a sampling plan. The sampling plan, you must answer issues like, how are you going to select a sample from the population? What approach will be used? What will be the sample size? And how are you going to administer the whatever, the questionnaire or whatever you have? So that is very, very important. You can't leave that one in your methodology section, whether for a proposal or for your research, when your study is a survey. Now, the survey design procedure require inputs from the people who will use the survey data and from those who will conduct the survey. This is critical. When you want to do a survey, you must get inputs from the people. In fact, people must understand and appreciate why you are undertaking a survey. That is why it is important when you are carrying out a survey, you must obtain permission from your institution. They write a letter and you must have that letter to accompany you to the authorities. And of course, it's part of ethical issues when it comes to survey. But you see, people, you must explain to them. You don't just go and say, I want to ask you questions. So you must make sure people do understand what you are doing, how you are going to use the results, and for what. But more importantly, if we are doing a survey, there are 2 critical parties to this process. The people who are going to conduct the survey themselves, and also the people from whom responses are sought. So they must be engaged in all stages, prior, during the development, and implementation. They must be part and parcel of the process. Now, we have spoken about sample. A survey, in most cases, we have to select a sample from the population, not everyone, just a portion, and then we generalize the results. What are the guiding factors? What factors determine sample selection? 1, population size. The bigger the population, obviously the bigger the sample, so that the sample becomes representative. You cannot go and ask one person out of 100 and you say, in generally all 100 people have agreed because you have asked one person. That is not correct. So the bigger the population, the bigger the sample. That is the principle, and vice versa also. It's homogeneity. How heterogeneous? When we talk of heterogeneous, we are talking of what are the variations within the population. If the population varies or differs significantly from one person to the other, then that will influence also the sample selection process. The sample media and its cost. You see, the media, if you are going to do face-to-face, where you need to go, that will also guide you on the sample size, because otherwise you may not complete. If you select too big a sample and you are supposed to go from one home state to the other, that is very difficult. The degree of precision required. This is very, very important. Of course, I will explain this a bit in the next slides. People selected to participate in the sample must be selected at random. You must not call your friends. You must not call your relatives. The process must be random to ensure that each element of the population has an equal chance of being selected. Now, Salant and Dillman in 1994 observed that a prerequisite to sample selection is to define the target population as narrow as possible. In other words, you must have a target population. I'm sure this is self-explanatory. Which population are you concerned with? So that is a guiding principle in then selecting a sample. Now, I just want to expand a bit. I know we did this in biostatistics, but there is no harm in mentioning, but I'll mention in passing. For introduction to research students, of course, I think I will expand on this. You don't need to worry. Now, we have sampling techniques. These sampling techniques, they are divided into what we call probability and non-probability sampling techniques. So I want you to know the differences between these two. When we talk of probability sampling techniques, each element has an equal chance of being chosen. Whereas for non-probability sampling techniques, some elements are excluded from the beginning. Not every element has an equal chance of being chosen. So these are different. This is dark and light, God and devil. You know, they are two different, tail and coin. They are two different things. They don't intersect. They are two sides of the poles. So the non-probability sampling techniques does not ensure that each element has an equal chance of being chosen. Now, I've given you a list for degree students. I want you to recall, go to your study materials. Library is still there. Do a research on your own. These are the probability sampling techniques. And these are the non-probability sampling techniques. I want you to research on one of these. Say something. Make sure you know what is simple random, what is systematic, what is stratified, what is cluster, what is multi-stage as a probability sampling technique. Especially this side, please, dear students, you need to know, when do we use systematic? When do we use stratified, for instance? We use stratified when the population is heterogeneous and we suspect that our responses can be affected by this heterogeneity. So we need to subdivide the big population into homogeneous subgroupings so that we have a balance. The views or the respondents, they represent all groups of people. What about cluster? When do we use it? When do we use systematic? When do we use simple random? Please go through. You must have that information, because when you are selecting the sampling technique to use as part of a sampling plan, which forms part and parcel of the survey design, you need to detail the specific sampling techniques that will be used, justifying why you are choosing that particular sampling technique. When it comes to non-probability, we have convenience sampling, Haphazard sampling, purposive sampling, expert sampling. Expert sampling is when you go to specific individuals who are known to be experts and you ask them. For instance, we want to understand why electricity is behaving in a certain manner in Namibia. We go to electrical engineers. If we have them, we go and ask them. That is expert sampling. It's not simple random, it's not systematic, it's not stratified cluster. That is expert. Then we have heterogeneity or diversity sampling. I want you to take note of that. You know, we select our sample in such a way that we include each and every member from the diverse group. But of course, go through to understand the literature behind each of these. We have modal instant sampling, we have quarter sampling, and snowballing. Snowballing, we don't know much about the population. We go to this person, maybe we know one person or two, we ask this one, we request that one to help us identify the other person to be asked. That is snowballing. But of course, I want you to go through, look at the advantages and disadvantages. Focus mainly on when each of these sampling methods are supposed to be used. Sometimes you may be given a scenario or a situation and you are asked which sampling technique will be appropriate and why. You can only answer that part if you know each and every sampling technique outlined or given in this slide. Now, after the subject of sampling has been dealt with, we now have a sampling technique. For instance, we have agreed we are going to use systematic. Now, but what about the sample size? I want you to appreciate that the higher the sample size, the lower the sampling error. And we want to reduce sampling error. So we want to make sure that our sample size is large enough to have the smallest possible sampling error. So, but how do we determine sample size? There are factors that needs to be considered. Firstly, the desired degree of precision, statistical power required. I want you, it's not only in some fields that we talk of power, we also talk of statistical power. Ability of the researcher to gain access to study subject. You don't say you want to select 3,000 people when you are struggling just to have access to 20 of those people. Such research will not be completed. Degree to which population can be stratified, that is very true. It is a determinant of sample size. Selection of the relevant units of analysis. Maybe I can expand this a bit. Desired degree of precision. The sample must be large enough to yield the desired level of precision. So there are two factors actually, or measures of precision. That is the significance level and the confidence interval. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I will not repeat myself here to try and explain the significance level. Remember, significance level is actually a probability. It's a probability of committing type 1 error. So that probability directly affects the sample size, and it's a measure of precision. If the significance level is high, say 10%, sample size normally becomes low because the accuracy of the results are also low. That is the principle. Statistical power is the probability that the researcher rejects the null hypothesis given that the alternative is true. In other words, it is the probability of correctly rejecting the null hypothesis. In other words, you avoiding type 2 error. So that directly affects sample size. Now, when we talk of access to the study subject, third factor in determining sample is the ability of the researcher to gain access. I think I've explained this. I don't need to re-explain. Degree to which the population can be stratified, sample size must be increased when using stratified sampling to maintain necessary precision within each stratum. That is very, very important. Now, with regard to selection of the relevant units of analysis, the researcher must decide whether the respondents to a survey will be individual offices or entire firms. Dear students, this is very, very important. Work groups may be a useful unit of analysis. It's true. Aggregating individual questionnaires responses across a team helps to lessen the effects of idiosyncratic or individual attitudes. You see, if you want to ask UNAM lecturers about a certain subject, say whether online classes is going well or not, don't ask one person and then you say, okay, in generally at UNAM, lecturers feel this. That is not correct. One lecturer cannot represent all the lecturers, even though they belong to the same group. The effect is what we call idiosyncratic or individual attitudes. So you need to, even though people might belong to the same group, same political party, they might differ in ideology. So you need to ask, instead of you asking one person to represent the group, you disaggregate, you aggregate, you ask different people from the same group, and then you can generalize to that group. Now, what are the sample size determination strategies? Now we have looked at the factors that affect sample size determination. What are the strategies? Firstly, you can do a census. The census, of course, is for small populations. We normally do a census every 10 years. Most countries, that is what they do. They normally do a full census where they want to count everyone. Now in Namibia, currently we are saying we're about 2.4, 2.5 million. But I suspect perhaps the population has gone up. We are yet to see the next census. Maybe is it 2023? I'm not sure. But the coming next census, we might realize maybe we are even 3 million. Who knows? So census is for small populations. But when the population becomes large, it is very, very difficult to carry out a census, especially at individual level. Of course, for a country, because of national resources, a country may afford to do a census, but for an individual or a simple small corporate, it might be very difficult. Now, imitating a sample size for similar study. Now, these are the approaches for determining. One person might say, no, I'm not going to sample, I'm going to select everyone. Sure, it's true. If the population is only made up of 50 people, and it's not costly to ask, you can just go and gather information from all the 50 people. But another similar way you look at your study, if other studies used a certain sample size and you strongly feel there is no need to vary, you can adopt the sample size and you cite, following the sample size used by so and so, in this particular study, we are also going to use the same, provided the studies are almost the same. So we can also use published tables or online software. I'm going to explain this in the next few videos. So we can also apply formulas. Don't say, dear students, next year you are presenting your research. You say, I used 60 people. You don't justify why 60. That is unscientific. That is not scientific. You need to say, in this study, 70 or 80 or 100 respondents will be selected. This is in line with a similar study where the same number of people were selected. Or this is the entire census. Or based on a sample size determination method proposed by so and so, using the sample tables that were compiled based on so and so sample size determination formula. Or you just need to say, I'm using method for determining sample size by Craig or by Yaman or by, you see, that then becomes scientific. Good friends, census is the oldest form of data collection. Census was even in the Bible. The Bible reports on the census for which everyone had to go back to their native town to be counted. You see, surveys even in the Bible. People were surveyed in the Bible. Firstborn children were counted in Egypt or so. That is biblical. It is used if the population is small and it eliminates sampling errors. However, this strategy may not work for large populations given financial constraints. I think this I have explained already. Now, when we talk of using a sample size of a similar study, through literature review, a researcher may use the sample size used in a similar study that he or she is undertaking. So using published tables, a researcher may rely on published tables, e.g. Yarman tables. I've given an extract, you are going to see that. So you can also take note that use of table replaces the need to compute the sample using the formula that was used to compile the table. The next slide is an extract of Yarman, 1967. There are other sample size determination methods. I want to challenge my dear students who are currently listening to this video to go yourself and ask or you look for information. How can a sample be determined? What sample size? What sampling methods? What sample size determination methods are available? Type that on Google, or you can look for the information. There are plenty of information. There are so many methods for determining sample size. Craig, for example, is one of the methods. I think Craig is 1963 or so. And this is the Yarman. Some on the publication, original publication says it's Taro. The name is the written Taro. So take note, maybe, I don't know, but others they call it Yaro. So we just need to be careful whether it's Taro Yarman or Yaro Yarman, or it can be both. I don't know, maybe the other one has a middle name. I don't know. These are the tables. You can get these tables. They are sometimes they are online, not sometimes they are actually online. You can get them. Here I've just given a small portion to illustrate the use of Taro Yarman. The first table is when the normality of the assumption of normality is the really in doubt, and the second one. So what happens, suppose you have got a population size of 500 and the desired error margin is 10%. Using Yaro Yarman, the sample size required is 83. When we talk of sample size, we are not talking of what you write on paper. We are talking of what you get after administering. So in most cases, when you want a sample size of 83, you don't go and ask 83 people. You send even 120 or so to make sure that when you factor in non-response and so forth, you end up having 83. So the Yaro Yarman formula basically is sample size n is equal to the population size big N divided by 1 plus the error margin E multiplied by big N. But E must be squared, please take note. So use these tables. Using the tables, verify the accuracy. This is E squared. Sorry. I think it's not visible. I'm saying N. No, I will illustrate on the next slide. But we are saying sample size N is equal to population size, big N, divided by 1 plus the E squared, where E is the error margin, multiplied by the population size. So you can try that even on this one. You'll see that you get those numbers that I've given you. Our sample size determination strategies, Yaro or Taro Yarman 1967. So this is the sample size using Yaro Yarman. Cochrane 1963 used this one. There are two for large sample and then for for small sample. Try it. Try this. Now, after having determined the sample size using a scientific approach, either using the tables or what others, the sample size that was used by others who did a similar study, you then need to decide on survey media choice. What media are you going to use? Are you going to call the people? Are you going to email them? What, online or what? So there are so many modes of survey administration. There is personal, face-to-face, or telephonic, or mail, or through a website, or in most cases a combination of these methods. But how do you decide which one to use? Whether to use face-to-face. Obviously, face-to-face, I suppose it can be costly. I know currently it's very hot when you have to do face-to-face. It's not easy. So you need to check the population, characteristics of the sample, types of questions to be asked, question topic, response rate, the cost, and the time. All these are the factors that affect or influence what mode of survey administration one must use. Now, once you have decided on the mode of survey instrument, you also need then to develop a survey tool. In most cases, it could be survey interview questions, or they could be a questionnaire. So the survey instrument development must be preceded by certain prerequisites. Firstly, the focus of the study must be carefully defined. Secondly, the study objectives must be translated into measurable factors, because when you are asking questions, those questions must directly address the objectives of the study. Thirdly, the researcher must ensure that he or she is well versed in the topic. You can't just start developing a questionnaire if you don't read widely around the topic. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, when you are doing your survey research next year, read extensively literature, related literature around your topic. That way then you are able to get a lot of information. You must be an expert in your topic. That will enable you to develop a questionnaire. After developing your questionnaire, don't just go and administer without consulting your supervisor or a statistician. That I have to mention it in no uncertain terms, because the chances are very high that you go and administer your questionnaire when in actual fact, when you get the questions, one, they are not addressing the objectives of the study. Two, they are not analyzable. Some questions are so difficult to analyze. You find somebody is doing a study, has got 1,000 questions. You ask yourself, why are these questions being asked anyway? So I want you, my dear students, to be aware of this. In different campuses, we have our statistics people. So approach them with your questionnaire. Ask whether this is correct. You can even ask them to help you to develop one questionnaire. That will be easy to analyze. Don't come with a box of questionnaires which are already completed and you say to a statistician, please help me analyze. It will be difficult. So when you are developing a questionnaire, make sure the researcher must ensure that she's versed in the topic. That is very, very important. Finally, the survey must be consistently administered. It must be consistently administered. So lastly, survey instruments should ideally be developed by experts in the measurement sciences. Those are statisticians. In fact, this is the literature, actually, Levy and Lemshaw in 1999 noted that statisticians should be called upon to provide input on the procedures that will be used to ascertain the quality of the data collected by the instrument and to ensure that the instrument is conducive to easy data processing and manipulation for analysis. Don't develop your own questionnaire unless if you are quite sure that you are capable of doing so, if you are quite sure that you are knowledgeable enough, and if you are sure you are very good in the field of measurement science. Now, there are, of course, standards for good survey questions. The survey questions are called test items. You see, like I said, this presentation is not exhaustive when it comes to survey, but I've tried to touch on the most important aspects that all of you need to know. But that should not replace the need for you to go and read on your own. What are the qualities of good test items or good questions for a questionnaire? You don't just ask any question. A good question is one that produces answers that are reliable and valid measures of something we want to describe. Ask yourself, this question will be used to answer which objective? Don't just ask for the sake of asking. You ask questions that are relevant, that will feed into the objectives. Be very careful when it comes to question wording. Survey questions should use words that are consistent with the education level of the intended respondents. You are going to ask communal farmers, but you are asking very technical issues. Do you think you will get responses? No one wants to, even myself, I think even yourself, my dear students, no one wants to present himself as somebody who don't know. Now you are going to people who maybe are ended in grade 8 or 10 or even lower. You are asking about technical issues, heat transfer systems, concepts of what, those big things. You must take cognizance of the education level of your respondents. They must be clear, the questions must be clear, and responses must be clear. Responses must also be clear to both the respondent and researcher. The wording should preclude alternative interpretations. You must not ask questions with multiple interpretations or incomplete sentences that would allow misinterpretation. Survey questions should not be combined where the respondents may wish to answer affirmatively for one part but negatively for another. You see, you don't need to put questions such as given that Hove is Hove a good lecturer? Right? That is one part. Is Hove a good lecturer? Would you recommend him for promotion? Look carefully at that question. Is Hove a good lecturer? That question requires yes or no. So you can answer affirmatively or negatively. Is Hove a good lecturer? And would you recommend him for promotion? Suppose the recommend for promotion, you want to say yes, but the part of good lecturer you want to say no. If you ask a question like that, there is no room, because at the end there is yes and no. So the questions, I want you to read very widely on this subject, on the qualities of good questions for a questionnaire. Go through. These are straightforward things you can read and understand the do's and the don'ts. Avoid double-barreled questions. Avoid leading questions. Feasible and ethical. Good questions must be feasible to answer and the respondents must be willing to answer them. Don't ask questions which some people may not be willing to. Don't ask. They will not answer. In fact, you may be chased away. They say, no, please, I don't have time for you. The researcher must avoid questions that ask the respondents for data that could not or do not have, include questions that assume the respondents know something about the subject. For those who have some knowledge of the Bible, there is a story of the road, the conversation between two men on the road to Emmaus when they met Jesus and could not recognize him. I want you to just read that portion for those who are able to. Just read that portion and check clearly the conversation, what was going on. And I'm sure you can learn something from there. What Jesus asked those two men who were talking. What are you talking about? And then the men also answered back to say, are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who does not know what has happened these days? See, that was now the response. So just check. You see, what I'm trying to say is that basically, don't ask questions which will cause people to withdraw their answers. Some questions are by nature sensitive. You don't ask. Don't ask people about their political opinions, for instance. Political affiliations in Africa. Of course, in some parts it may be, it may be something that can be asked, but in some parts you may not ask because political affiliation is a punishable issue. So when you are asking, you need to avoid drawing people along those lines, because that will disturb your research. The researcher must avoid questions that involve double negative and long questions that lose the respondent in the reading. Undefined abbreviation. Have you ever visited the AU? AU it can be contextual. It can mean Agriculture Union. It can mean African Union. So don't use abbreviations. Sometimes some abbreviations are known. When you are asking, you draft questionnaires. Don't say, suppose, have you ever visited UNA? You need to define that, University of Namibia. Then you can subsequently say UNA. But don't just use abbreviations which are not explained. Avoid technical jargons. Have you ever grown a Eucalyptus camajulensis, Eucalyptus tereticonis, Pisidium guajava? Those terms they are understood by scientists in that field. So it will be good for you to use plain language. You can put the technical term in bracket, but make sure, because the purpose is for the respondent to understand. If you lose the respondent, you lose the answer. The tone of survey questions should avoid the biased wording. Don't go for a survey with vested interest. You must not even declare your interest. You go there and you say, given that the government has failed, it's you who thinks government has failed, not the respondent. You see, when you are going, don't have preconceived ideas. You are going to the people because you want to get the information. Don't tell them what to tell you or put words in their mouth. Biased wording is often observed where the question includes a predisposition either for or against a particular perspective. Such questions may be leading or include assumptions that may not be true. You make a statement, say, given that a lot of people have been dying, what would you recommend? You see, the given that a lot of people have been dying, it's hypothetical. It's not axiomatic, it's hypothetical. You cannot make that statement and then you ask a question because your question is premised or is sitting on a debatable notion. So you need to avoid those things. I cannot deal with the idea of questions, good questions, in this particular presentation. This is just an outline, but the onus is with you to go in detail and try to get the things. Biased context results from the placement of questions in a particular order so that a respondent is already thinking along certain lines on the basis of previous questions. You see, it's very easy to lead people into a certain type of thinking by layout of questions and so forth. You don't need to do that way. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will do justice to yourself. It's a critical topic. Some of you, I know you won't even do an experiment. So I expect you to read more. What I have given you is just an outline. Of course, this video is accompanied with notes and also some supplementary materials that you may use to reinforce your understanding of the concepts. Thank you very much for listening. Of course, it's a bit long, but I think it's worth it because I'm trying to cover the whole section on survey in one go. So listen to the video, you can pause, you can edit the video and put it in smaller parts. Meet in the next topics. Thank you.